So whenever you are looking at a trustee or a general meeting, looking to the possibility of making a decision, you have to tie that back to some statutory provision or some provision in the governance documents that allows them to do that.
Yes, it's a really good point. And I want to expand on that by giving an example of something that we see quite often in practice, and that is the effect that the new legislation has had on body corporate rules that were made pre-October 2016, which is when the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act and the CSOS Act came in. And so prior to October 2016, many schemes, either through the developer or later by the body corporate, added a fining or penalty rule into the body corporate's rules, okay? And these old kind of style fining rules often are worded along the lines that the trustees can simply decide that somebody has breached a scheme rule, and then they can impose a levy without any due process being followed, without any hearing taking place, without hearing the perpetrator's side of the story, okay? And we're going to dive into fines and penalties more in module 2. But the reason that I want to use this as an example is because it shows us how trustees can't exceed a body corporate's powers, okay? So when the new legislation came into force in October 2016, what happened was all the new prescribed management and conduct rules automatically applied to all sectional title schemes in South Africa. And any additional rules that that scheme had made, or a scheme had made, prior to the new legislation coming into effect. So any new rules or amended rules that have been made under the prior legislation only remained in force if those rules are not irreconcilable with the current act or prescribed rules. So, for example, this scheme, let's use, Happy Places Body Corporate has had pre-16 a fining rule which says trustees can impose fines without due process being followed. Now, that rule would not be concilable. It's irreconcilable with the current legislation. And that means that that rule actually doesn't apply. So what happens is a lot of trustees think that they have the power under their old rules to fine somebody without due process being followed. But in actual fact, they don't. And CSOS has made this very clear in its practice directive circular on amendment of rules, where they set out that any fining rule will be considered non-compliant if it doesn't include certain elements. And one of those elements is there needs to be a due process followed and a hearing for the alleged perpetrator to come forward, have a meeting with the trustees, tell them their side of the story, make sure that there's that element of transparency and being heard. So this is an interesting sort of example of where trustees might think they have the power, but they're actually exceeding the body corporate's power because that rule is no longer valid and enforceable. And because there is no provision in the Sectional Titles Act or prescribed rules that allows for fining, if the body corporate hasn't adopted a valid and enforceable fining provision in line with CSOT's practice directives requirements, then it doesn't have the power to impose fines.